basically the same as long-term care homes, except that they're private pay. And they exist because there aren't enough long-term care beds, publicly subsidized beds. There's very long waiting lists. And so this gap exists where you have people who need heavier care, but can't get into the LTCs. And so retirement living as a business has emerged to fill this gap with private pay care. And it's expensive. One of the reasons financial firms have flooded into seniors housing is that they can charge exorbitant monthly rates to provide this privatized care in retirement living facilities. So this is a list of the biggest seniors housing owners in Canada. The firms that have their name in bold are financial firms. So as you can see, most of the biggest owners are financial firms. Two of the biggest, Welltower REIT and Ventus REIT, are actually the biggest healthcare real estate investment trusts in the US. And they moved to Canada in order to capitalize on this opportunity to provide privatized care in retirement living properties. Also, fun fact for Australians, Sienna Senior Living, which is number 6, was owned by Australia's Macquarie Investment Bank up until 2010. So in seniors housing, financial firms make money from both the real estate, in the same way that we saw profit making in apartments, but also from operating businesses, which are operated out of the real estate. And there's two types of businesses, hotel style hospitality business and healthcare, private pay healthcare business. So the way that firms make profits from seniors housing on the real estate end, they do repositioning, similarly to in apartment buildings, acquiring existing buildings. For retirement living centers, they'll upgrade the rooms, make them nicer, sometimes change the unit mix, add more of those expensive assisted living or memory care units. When it comes to long-term care homes, repositioning is funded by the government. So there's redevelopment programs to upgrade older homes. And the play for a lot of these firms is to acquire older homes and access these redevelopment funds, and then they can make some money for their investors that way. The other real estate strategy is rent increases. So this is a revenue generation strategy in seniors housing. In retirement living, especially, rents are very high, and firms are systematically trying to increase the rent fees every month or every year. And then turning to the operating businesses, firms generate more revenues by charging for these services. So half of the monthly fees that they charge, one half is for rent, the other half is typically for services. And the strategy is to escalate these charges over time as people need more services. In addition, another strategy is just simply to capitalize on private pay healthcare. So this is just taking advantage of the fact that you have these long waiting lists for long-term care homes. And because of this, seniors are forced to seek alternative arrangements, as one of these financial firms has noted in their IPO prospectus. Finally, a big way to save money is by cutting back on labor costs. Labor is the single largest cost driver in seniors housing. It's difficult in their documents to find clear-cut references to for their plans to cut labor costs. But I did find Welltower REIT, which owns lots and lots of properties, noted clearly that their strategy when they acquire a new property is to reduce staff numbers. And this really matters because researchers have found that firms that have lower staff to resident ratios also have lower quality of care outcomes. So how do seniors pay for this? Well, firms are counting on seniors coming and paying in order to make profits for their investors. And they plan to capitalize on a couple things. First of all, the sale of seniors' homes. So in Canada, we have this sort of asset-based welfare regime where people are meant to save for their own retirement by buying a home and having that appreciate. So these firms recognize that right now, a lot of seniors have homes that they will be selling, and their plan is to take that wealth to finance their retirement living. In addition, they're aiming to capture pension payments, which people earn after a lifetime of contributions made over their working lives. And finally, they're capitalizing on the privatization of social reproduction, as women have entered the workforce in recent decades and are no longer doing as much unpaid elder care work. These firms are planning to also access money from their children, including women who now have more income to pay for care. So women may have been freed from some of this unpaid care, but they're paying for it. I'll just briefly discuss the impacts and then wrap up. So ultimately, the financialization of seniors housing can have some negative effects. By raising rents, these strategies extract more from seniors and their families. As I mentioned, this is funded by people's house sales, their pensions, taking on debt, and through their children's earnings. And because a lot of this housing is quite pricey, it excludes lower income seniors. There's also impacts on the quality of care. In long-term care homes, researchers have found that for-profit ownership is related to reduced care outcomes, including things like having lower staffing, fewer registered nurses, more deficiencies in homes. But what about specifically financial care or financially owned homes? Well, there's fewer studies that look specifically at financial firms, but researchers have found that financial ownership is associated with lower quality of care, lower staffing levels. In the US, fewer Medicaid assisted clients. And then this is a big one, a 10% increase in deaths in the US in nursing homes that are acquired by private equity firms. So major impact on care. And finally, the savings that these firms make often come at the expense of staff in long-term care homes and retirement living. So domestic care aides, domestic workers and care aides. These are typically low-paid part-time workers, mostly women and immigrant workers, and cutting their pay and hours creates more stressful environments, more injury and violence. So to summarize, because I think I'm closing in on 20 minutes here, I'll just say that in both apartments and seniors housing, we've seen how financial firms are extracting value from people over their life course. In my work, I argue that we should be seeking ways to definancialize ownership of these properties, increase publicly subsidized housing, including seniors housing and apartments. Because these types of firms are really only in the housing field from what they can get out of it, not what they can contribute. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Martine. It was riveting, if not terrific. We have up next Esther Sullivan. Bala will pull up the PowerPoint. As I said before, Esther's from University of Colorado, Denver, and she's the authority on manufactured housing in
Thank you so much for having me here today. So to advance, I just go like that. Okay, perfect. Yeah, I'm Esther Sullivan. I'm a sociologist, and I study affordable housing and housing insecurity. And I'm the author of this book, Manufactured Insecurity, Mobile Home Parks and Americans' Tenuous Right to Place. And the research for this book, and then the research that I've done on manufactured housing in the decades since I conducted field work for this book, is kind of the topic of the discussion I wanted to have with you today. So in the United States, these communities are called manufactured home communities. You may have also heard them called mobile home parks or trailer parks. You have these communities in Australia where they're called residential parks, sometimes manufactured home estates, or as I'll call them today, land lease communities. They're also sometimes called caravan parks, but there's an interesting distinction there that I'll talk a little more about. Because it's important to note that in both countries and in Canada, these communities are providing a place to place a manufactured home, not a camper, a permanent manufactured home. So they offer sites where a resident can lease land to place one of these manufactured homes. A manufactured home is simply a home that's prefabricated in a factory and then moved onto the site. And that factory production process means that a manufactured home costs less than half to build than a site-built home per square foot. So in a manufactured home community, then a resident would not have to purchase land. They can rent the lot where they can place one of these manufactured homes. And because they're so affordable to construct in a factory, these homes currently provide the single largest source of unsubsidized affordable housing in the United States. So this means this is a primary way that low-income Americans find housing without state support. And this is really important because, you know, when we think of contemporary affordable housing in the US context, but increasingly globally, the last 4 decades have seen deep cuts to state support for affordable housing production. So that today, you know, less than 2% and falling of our population in the US lives in public housing, what you would call social housing. And the vast majority of low-income Americans are going to find a house that they can afford on the private market. So when we think of contemporary affordable housing, we really need to think of something that looks more like this. Nationally, in the US, 18 million Americans are living in a manufactured home. And throughout the 90s, 2/3 of all new affordable housing produced in the US was manufactured housing. And beyond just providing affordable housing generally for owners and renters, manufactured housing is a really crucial source of low-income home ownership. So nearly 1 in 4 of homes purchased by a low-income first-time home buyer is a manufactured home. Now, in Australia, in a similar context of dwindling social housing and shortfalls on the private rental housing, there's an estimated, I got this from my friends this week at our workshop, there's an estimated 95,000 units, housing units in caravan parks or LLCs, and about half of these are on a site where the resident owns the home but rents the land. So that's a similar land tenure that we have in the US, where about 40% of manufactured housing is located in a manufactured housing community. And these communities are my particular area of concern because this unique divided owner-renter land tenure means that this is just a deeply insecure form of housing. It creates what I call halfway homeowners who lack rights to the land under their homes, their largest asset, all of their investment. Because the majority of these park properties are owned by private landlords, these landlords can raise rents, they can charge fees, they can fail to maintain properties, and ultimately they can legally close and redevelop the property. In the process, entire communities are evicted. And these community closures and redevelopments are common. I used geospatial analysis to map community closures in just one Texas county, Houston, over a decade. And during that time, I cataloged 119 closed communities. In Houston, a single community, it can be home to hundreds of homes. So 119 closed communities is the eviction of many thousands of residents.
No trees.
So yeah. And another issue that we will talk about, what does that mean for disasters and hazard exposure? Yeah, but first, you know, let's talk about, you know, how did we get here to a place where, at least in the US, one of our largest sources of affordable housing is one of our most insecure. I want to, in the time that I have, I want to describe some of the key takeaways from my research on housing insecurity in these communities, which I've conducted using geospatial analysis, using qualitative interviews with stakeholders in the industry, on city councils, in state agencies, and then most importantly, 2 consecutive years of ethnographic fieldwork where I lived full-time inside closing communities, was evicted alongside residents, and followed them into new housing. I did this in communities in Florida and Texas because these are the 2 US states with the largest mobile home populations. And importantly, the ethnography took place before, during, and after parks were closed. So here's a picture of field work, you know, before a closure took place. And here's a picture conducting field work during a park closure. And I can talk about these communities and my ethnographic methods or anything else during Q&A. But I wanted to outline kind of 3 broad areas of concern related to manufactured home communities that are relevant in the Australian case. The first relates to planning and the reproduction of what I call socio-spatial stigma. As I claimed, manufactured housing communities as a privately owned and operated source of affordable housing are really the face of contemporary affordable housing. But it's a face that we don't often see. And that's not by accident. It's really by design. Because over a century of planning policies in the US, at least, have kept these communities hidden from view. A kind of quick history of manufactured housing in the US. Manufactured housing originates as the auto campers of really the very wealthy, luxury items of those that can afford an automobile and a little home to tow behind it. But shortly after they're invented in the 1920s, the Great Depression begins, and soon these homes are being used by low-income residents traveling in desperate search of work. And they located these homes in municipal campgrounds and used them as permanent housing. As their numbers continued to grow, city councils begin to respond to these trailer camps by instituting restrictive ordinances and exclusionary zoning. In doing so, they followed the late 19th century precedent of using zoning as a tool to exclude socially undesirable ethnic minorities into Chinatowns and such. So these are really the roots of what I call socio-spatial stigma. And today in the US, dating back a century, zoning codes prohibit manufactured housing from being located near, quote, conventional housing, both owned and rented. And this treatment is really reified in planning policies of today. A National American Planning Association study showed that across the nation, manufactured home communities are mislocated onto inferior lands away from residential areas. They're usually zoned outright out of residential areas, and they're located in commercial and industrial zones. There's an analogy to the Australian case here, though these processes certainly occur later. Historically here, land lease communities emerged out of caravan parks, what you would think of as like a holiday park where you could bring an RV or a camper. Now, a true caravan park is a site for a camper, right? But these communities, at least since the 1980s, were used as both a source of permanent and temporary housing. And over time, these caravan parks became increasingly formalized and permanent. Today, true caravan parks certainly exist in Australia, a holiday park where you could bring your camper. But many caravan parks are home to permanently installed manufactured housing in Australia. And new manufactured housing communities on greenfield sites are being developed in Australia, what I'm calling land lease communities. So in the late 90s and early 2000s, Australian jurisdictions did respond to land lease communities as a community type by implementing planning controls and park-specific legislation. Back to the US, in the US, planning policies that zone these parks out of residential zones create a range of locational disadvantages that you can imagine and that I've documented in my research. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to touch on one. Though I should say my colleagues and I and others in the US are showing how these regulations disproportionately expose manufactured housing to the impacts of a range of disasters, including floods, hurricanes, extreme heat, tornadoes. My team mapped manufactured housing across the Houston metro, and we found that areas with manufactured home communities have on average greater amounts of land in the 100-year floodplain than lands without parks. And in Australia, planning policies that have permitted the construction of land lease communities on a wider range of sites compared to residential housing kind of evolved out of that evolution of land lease communities from caravan parks, right, which could be established on a wider range of land, including reserves and rural land. So these sites might also be cheaper, making them more appealing to developers. Tort and Rumming show that the practice of permitting the development of LLCs on lands that were zoned as caravan parks permits their development on a wider range of residential areas, including hazard affected lands, lands affected by floods, land affected by bushfire, and lands that are more distant from amenities and services. So this is a picture of a community that I got from our friends at the Tenants Union of New South Wales. This is a community in Tweed in North New South Wales. And this is just one, this is the recent flooding that y'all had here. And this is just one of several land lease communities that were flooded in this way. This park is zoned as a caravan park. Now, at the same time that these communities can be located on non-residential, inferior, or hazard-prone locations, that divided land tenure, that owner-renter land tenure, means that residents then have less control over their properties, right? Which is certainly important to mitigate against a disaster or to recover following a disaster. And that divided land tenure also shapes a second key process that I want to make sure that I touch on, which is housing insecurity and ultimately forced relocation in manufactured home communities. I have documented how this divided land tenure structures the legal sale, closure, and redevelopment of manufactured housing communities across the US. These manufactured housing community residents lack legal right to the property under their homes. And so when parks close, they're forced to move both themselves and their homes. And that's if their home can be moved. In many cases, it cannot. In my research, a third of residents' homes were not considered structurally sound for a relocation, and these residents lost everything: their home, all their accrued housing equity. So I won't go into this today, but in the book, I follow how these mass evictions unfold. I detail the strategies employed by the 180 residents that took part in my study. I follow their trajectories post-displacement, and I document the community and individual impacts. These mass evictions have also occurred in the Australian case in the late 1990s and early 2000s as urban sprawl meant that redeveloping large tracts of land was lucrative. Since that time, state governments have passed legislation to provide greater protection to land lease community residents here, giving longer periods of notice that are required and assistance with expenses if they are forced to relocate. But just as in the US, this legislation doesn't stop redevelopment, right? It just makes it more expensive and time consuming for developers. But this threat of displacement is important, right? Even if a park doesn't close. I call this the specter of dislocation, because it truly haunts residents before, during, and after a park closure, or even if they're living in a park that doesn't ever close and evict them. And that's important in the Australian case where people are potentially maybe more insulated from or more protected from a full eviction. But the specter of dislocation living on that rented land still impacts residents who own the home but not the land and are subject to, ever increasing rents or arbitrary fees or arbitrary landlord practices or failure to maintain properties, right? All of which impact their housing security. So this specter of dislocation, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. It is shaped by economic forces that are operating well beyond individual manufactured home communities. So in my work, in addition to following the paths of evicted residents, I followed the money, and I conducted ethnographic fieldwork alongside landlords and developers, industry reps, and investors. I attended and was trained at the for-profit Mobile Home University in hotel ballrooms where real estate entrepreneurs learn the ins and outs of mobile home community investing from self-termed mobile home park investment guru Frank Rolfe, who is he's the owner of the fourth largest individual mobile home community portfolio in the US. So he certainly has had success. And Frank opened our Mobile Home Park University seminar by going over what he called the Mobile Home Park Investors Mantra. He told us affordable housing is the hottest arena in commercial real estate right now. With over 20% of Americans trying to live on $20,000 per year or less, the demand for mobile homes has never been higher, and the big winners are the owners of the mobile home parks in which those customers reside. So Frank is making an explicit connection between the lack of affordable housing and the profits to be made off of housing in manufactured home communities. And indeed, the largest owners of manufactured home communities are billionaires, Warren Buffett and Sam Zell, and then global institutional investors like Blackstone and the Carlyle Group. Between 2020 and 2021, when Fannie Mae tracked it, Sun Communities was the top investor in manufactured home communities, buying up properties from smaller mom and pops, over 24 months investing $1.8 billion in communities across the country. And Sun Communities also purchased a stake in Ingenia Lifestyle Communities, which is the largest owner and operator for land lease communities for seniors in Australia. Over the last decades, mobile home parks have increasingly been consolidated under corporate ownership and become a favored, quote, undervalued asset class for real estate investment trusts of the kind that Dr. August described, and especially for private equity firms. And this is truly a global phenomenon. Some of the largest private equity firms in the world have made significant multi-billion-dollar investments in trailer parks. The emergence of private equity specifically and real estate investment trusts, some of the best performing real estate investment trusts on the US stock market are bundles of manufactured home communities. All of this really marks a new phase in the financialization of low-income housing in the US. The private equity stakeholder project cataloged $1.77 trillion of investments made over the last decade by a range of global institutional investors. Private equity firms specifically, they seek to generate rates of return 15 to 25% by buying businesses, taking those businesses, making changes to those businesses, and then taking the businesses public. Generating that kind of rate of return necessitates increasing rents and cutting costs. It necessitates the specter of dislocation. As just one example, residents in manufactured home communities purchased by Haven Park Capital Partners got together and published this report documenting dramatic increases in lot rent in parks owned by Haven Park. Increases as much as 50 and 60%. So these investments have clear links to the buying up of toxic assets in rental housing markets that occurred after the real estate collapse of 2008. So that today, global corporate landlords are deeply rooted in local housing markets, just as Dr. August described. My research in manufactured home communities is really an attempt to reframe analysis of affordable housing insecurity away from the individual extractive relationships between individual landlords and their tenants, and to show how an international web of linked industries both produces and profits from housing insecurity. The rush of global capital into manufactured home communities is likely a bellwether for practices of extraction and capital accumulation that are going to target other forms of housing. But, I'll leave you by saying that just as perhaps manufactured home communities are a bellwether for this kind of financialization, they can also be a model for how alternative forms of property ownership can stabilize affordable housing. There's another push to purchase these manufactured home community lands, and that's coming from residents themselves. A move towards collective ownership is happening in hundreds of parks across the US, where nonprofit groups are helping residents to collectively get a loan to purchase the land under their homes so they can own their park themselves and manage it. These communities have demonstrated that cooperative ownership promotes long-term housing affordability and long-term housing stability. So I'll leave you this kind of clear policy prescription. You know, we can push for laws that facilitate resident purchases of communities. But more broadly, you know, we can also try to imagine, try to research, and if we're so inclined, we can advocate for alternate forms of collective or non-speculative property ownership, like what's happening here. So with that, I'll just say thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Esther, for a view into a sector that has been deliberately marginalised. There's a lot more going on there than people think. I'll take, we've got 10 minutes for discussion, and I'll go first to the people in the room here for questions, but also if there are any popping up in the chat bar, you can let me know, and I'll relay those to the speakers. Do you want any questions to head off? It might be Hal first.
It's fantastic, both of you. Just such a great combination, and just tremendous. Connecting with Australia and the various different parts of North America, just really informative and shocking in parts. Esther, with yours, at the end there, that was a really great way to finish with a a positive side to this, or the potential for it. So you're giving a lot of emphasis to maybe a co-owner or a collective ownership model, which is an alternative. But if that isn't feasible, how much scope is there to regulate the privately owned industry a lot more than it is? And maybe in some states it's better done than others, I don't know. Or maybe the Constitution doesn't allow that, and companies are always able to fight these things off. But surely there are efforts to regulate the practice of displacement.
Yeah, I mean, there certainly are efforts, and what we have in the United States, in absence of federal, national legislation, what we have is basically 50 different policies towards regulating these parks, which range from basically total laissez-faire, almost nothing on the books, to some really innovative manufactured housing strategies, state strategies. And in just the time that I've been doing this work, I've seen more and more states going in that direction. In the time that I've lived in Colorado, our state has passed two huge, the Mobile Home Park Residents Bill of Rights, and then Protections for Mobile Home Park Residents Act. And the main things that these, the best things really that these acts can do is, well, provide some kind of third party, because we don't have strong tenants unions in the United States. And so states will sometimes mandate like a complaint hotline so that complaints between landlords and tenants can go to mediation. I mean, this is so important because, as you can imagine, this is not like if you're a renter in an apartment and you have an issue with your landlord. Your whole asset and probably all of your wealth, because in the United States, your housing wealth basically is your wealth, is invested in this landlord's property. So they have all the power. And so that kind of dispute resolution, and then of course, longer notices if the park is going to close, longer lease periods, anything that can stabilize their relationship to their land tenure are being tried out in some states and are helpful.
Thanks.
Mine follows on from Al's.
Hazel, and then I'll go to our guest on the front. Hazel.
Also on your very last comment and suggestion, your legislative suggestion, it made me think of another connection, which you may already be aware of, but you may not, which is in England, the change in legislation to allow for people who own apartments on leased land to purchase the land that their apartments are on. So people who own apartments under leasehold in England, legislation was changed a while ago to facilitate the purchase of that land from the landowner by the owners of the units that sit on the land, which is essentially what you're proposing here, I think. So I thought it might be quite interesting for you to look at that legislation as an example of a similar scenario where people own the property but don't own the land. It's a little different in the leasehold situation. They also don't own the building, but they do own long leases of the units.
Yeah. No, and that is important. And your comment brings up something else, which is that like this is not just about mobile home parks or manufactured home communities. There's so many ways that there's these unclear or gray area housing tenures, land tenures that can put people at risk. And so it's interesting to think about that.
Thanks, Hazel.
Yeah. Question for Martine. In Australia, in Melbourne particularly, and more recently in Sydney, is a new real estate thing going on called build to rent, which is where large companies, often with the backing of major superannuation firms, make a multi-unit building, and the idea being for very, very long-term rental. And the superannuation funds are happy with that because they're getting a lower rental because it goes over a long period of time. And supposedly that is adding more possibly affordable units to the housing market. In your talk, you talked about 2 or 3 firms are really going at it for financial reasons. In the mix of firms that you had illustrated there, is there anything like a build to rent in Canada, and how does that compare with the firms who are largely financial firms? You know?
Yeah, we have a lot of, well, the financial firms are largely buying existing rental housing properties.
Yeah.
There's a little bit less of building new stock. Most of the rental housing, multi-unit residential rental housing apartment buildings were built in like the 60s, 70s. And then since then, there hasn't been much built. And so what these firms are trying to do is acquire a finite stock and try to consolidate ownership of as much of it as possible. And if that's a big part of their business model, saying, you know, similarly to what Esther mentioned, like there's an affordable housing crisis. We don't have enough supply. This is great for our company and for our investors because we're going to buy as much of it as we can. And in some small towns, they buy almost all the apartments. In Canada's north, we have Northern Territories. They own like 70, 80% of all the apartments. So it's a wild monopoly. But in terms of building new apartments, there's lots of most new multi-residential buildings in Canada are condominium, like strata ownership buildings. It's more profitable. In recent years, there's been a slight increase in the rise of new rental buildings, and some of them are being built by these types of firms. In areas like with very, very hot markets where the economics make sense. But when they're building a new rental building, it's not going to be affordable. They're only doing it to provide luxury kind of rents. And then really playing into this like rhetoric that they're doing something to help the housing crisis by providing new units, even though these are very upmarket rental units that, aren't going to be accessible to people with lower incomes.
Any other questions? I don't think we've got any online, so you can have at it here. Alistair.
First of all, sorry I was late. Train delays preventing me from getting here on time. But I had a question for Esther, again relating to the final slide where you were talking about tenants organising, or I guess homeowners in this case, organising to purchase the land that their homes are sitting on. I guess I'm wondering, what are the conditions that lead to that kind of organising? Is it mostly when there's an imminent threat of displacement, or are people being more proactive, learning from places elsewhere in the country that that threat is a possibility.
At this point, it's usually when there's a very imminent threat. Yeah, and yeah, I mean, these are huge purchases. You have to think like, basically these residents, low income residents are, they need to get together to put together a $20 million purchase offer on these lands, because manufactured home communities, they're big plots of land oftentimes. And so usually that's been the case, you know, in almost every case I can think of. Even recent ones in Colorado, where it's either another person has come in and put in a purchase offer, and that triggers a requirement that residents be notified. And then that triggers nonprofits coming in. So really, there's a lot of like issues around capacity building. Nonprofits play a huge role in assisting residents to get these kinds of loans.
Sorry if I can follow that up with another question. Is there any scope within the activity of those nonprofits to start to more proactively organize these communities that aren't facing?
There certainly is. There certainly is. Like, there's a national group called Resident Owned Communities USA, Rock USA, and they have a podcast and they have you know, newsletters, and so they're constantly trying to get residents to think about how, you know, the benefits of resident-owned communities, and they're also trying to get investors to think about the benefits of making these kinds of loans, because in all of their portfolio, they haven't had a single like default on one of these loans, and they're actually they perform well. And so that's another thing, you know, beyond just like small community banks, how can we get this kind of financing to make this easier for residents?
Does anyone want to raise a hand from the online participants, or yes, there's Alan raising his hand. Alan Morris.
Hi,
Dave.
thanks very much. I wanted to ask the bit of research I've done on manufactured housing villages. What struck me was that the social ties were often very strong. I mean, there was a real sense of, I suppose, community. Maybe you could comment on that, you know, compared to normal city living. I felt that the fact that the houses are so close together, people are, you know, it's very homogenous, etc. It's like certainly created fertile ground for very strong social ties between the residents.
Yeah, certainly. I'm going to use this as an opportunity to show my video that I took inside a park in central New South Wales. Is this advancing the slide? It's just on the next slide.
Can I still see the screen?
Can you still see the screen? And you can see that the built environment, I mean, for planners, right? The built environment of these. Okay, the next slide. Maybe it won't. Any ideas?
Well, about that.
It's just like embedded in the next slide. But yeah, exactly the things that you're saying, where, well, certainly there's a oh, here we go. So this is in New South Wales. I like this video because, first of all, it shows you how permanent these homes are, right? How not, how unlike a camper or an RV or things that people might think. But it also, you'll see how close together the homes are, how narrow the streets are. And all of these things are really conducive to community cohesion, to like eyes on the street in a kind of Jane Jacobs sense. Oh, it didn't work. Well, you'll just have to imagine residents in this video, they come out and wave. Yeah, I mean, the homes in this community were literally like 2 feet apart. And so unlike, you know, I think there's a stigma that these communities can be unsafe for some reason, I guess because low income people live there. But in the US, crime statistics show that they're actually more safe than other communities. And most important for our discussion, they're really safe places for aging in place. And so in the words of, you know, my colleagues now at New South Wales, they're naturally occurring retirement communities where in Australian parks, 75.6% of residents in land lease communities are aged 55 and older. And so that built environment of closely knit houses, closed in streets, is a really, safe and nice environment for many people.
Thanks, Esther. Thanks, Alan.
Pleasure.
I think sometimes that strong community is sometimes because there's a common enemy in the operator, and some of them are pretty wild. That's we're past the end of our usual time slot. I might farewell the people who are online. I'll thank again our wonderful presenters today, Esther Sullivan, Martine August. Thanks everyone for participating.
Thank you.
We do have one more seminar this year. I think it's a PhD student